Welcome all. We are thrilled to have you here for our conversation on a new book and a very thoughtful idea, Longevity Hubs, which looks at the concept of regional innovation for global aging. And we are going to have our conversation with the editors, Joseph Coughlin and Luke Yoquinto. We are thrilled to have you here in our virtual world at the University of Chicago. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago. Welcome to our wintry campus. Although the snow is beginning to disappear here, this is a few days ago in nature, and the snow that is showing. We are, for those who are not familiar, the home of lifelong learning at the university, and we have been here since the founding because when William Rennie Harper was imagining this university with John D. Rockefeller, they wanted to ensure that the ideas of this great university and other great institutions would not just be for traditional students, but would truly be carried into the world and be available to people across all ages and stages of their lives. We continue that mission today with programs across the liberal arts and with many public events that you can join to better understand these issues as a public learner. Coming up over the next week, we'll have a number of gatherings. We're going to have an information session on our cohort-based program around dimensions of diversity. We're going to be looking at healthcare for a long life world with the head of University of Chicago's medicine. And then we're going to be offering a sample class on George Washington's farewell address that will look at how it portrays America's role in international relations, including drawing some comparisons to big issues that are currently in front of our country. I'll also just mention for those of you who want to get into your classes that spring course registration is not only open, but a number of classes are now full. So we encourage you, if you are interested in being a learner in a deep way this spring, to take a look at your earliest convenience. And with that, I'm going to take down my screen, and on it, you are going to see our guests, Luke and Joseph. We have shared your biographies in advance with our audience. So I will just say that these are two individuals who are truly moving our understanding of aging. And the AgeLab that they are a part of, Joseph in leadership of, and Luke as a research leader, it is truly changing our understanding of aging in a very deep way at a time when longevity is at the very forefront of our minds. And so, as a university where we are building programs for people who are experiencing this longevity, you have been an extraordinary resource for us to better understand aging and to look at all the opportunities it presents. So, immense thanks to both of you as we get started. And I want to start with maybe what's a very straightforward question, given your book is called Longevity Hubs. But can you talk about what longevity hubs are and how this concept originally emerged? And I'll maybe open it up to either of you. Joseph, I know you've been a part of this a bit longer, but I'll follow your lead and who wants to get started with that question.
Luke, I'll let you run with that.
Sure, I'll take it and run with it. So first of all, thank you so much for having us, Jeff. It's such a pleasure to be here and to speak with you and all the folks in the audience. We're very excited to join you. Innovation for older adults is a really tricky thing, and this is the subject of Joe's earlier book called The Longevity Economy, which maybe some folks in the audience will have heard of. And it's tricky because unique among major consumer demographics, people who are retired are sort of definitionally not at work. And if they're not at work, then they're not there with input into how products and services and policies are designed for themselves. That's different from people who are working age, right? So it's like there's a mismatch right from the beginning when it comes to innovating and making better things to make life easier and a higher quality of life for older people. And that's the subject of this book, The Longevity Economy, which Joe wrote and was published in 2017. And we were talking about this and kicking around further ideas in the years following when a piece of media sort of crossed our electronic doorsteps, which was it was honestly a listicle from Inc. magazine about which cities were the best places to start a company. And Boston, to no great credit to us, was number 15, which was better than 16, but not exactly at the top of the list. And, fine. But what was interesting was the author of the piece, whose name was Lee Buchanan, described Boston as, well, what was it, Joe?
It was the Silicon Valley of aging, I believe is what they call it.
something like that, which was kind of new on us, right? It's like, oh, well, why would you need a Silicon Valley for aging? Surely people are innovating for aging all across the country and the world. But we started sort of throwing the football back and forth, so to speak, about this idea. And we said, well, actually, there is sort of a hotspot happening here. And the big obvious thing we could point to was PillPack, which is this online pharmacy firm that was founded in the Boston suburb, because Boston is actually a collection of very close suburbs. That was it was an invention that came from a nursing home. The founder's father had been doing this, where they package pills by time of day, time of consumption, and not type of pill, and turned it into a startup. Amazon bought it for $1 billion, and this sort of successful exit for this startup was reverberating around town at this time. And there are other things too. Care.com which is the major marketplace for elder care and babysitting, was headquartered in the Boston suburb. You have all these robotics companies, and of course, pharma. Moderna is a Cambridge company. And so we started talking about what if there is sort of a hot spot around aging innovation here in Boston. And so I'll just tell you the story. We pitched an article to the Boston Globe saying, hey, Silicon Valley was sort of supposed to happen in Boston, but it didn't. Boston was the hotspot of computer technology in the 1980s until the personal computer happened, and that happened in Silicon Valley. And that's why it happened out there and not in cold and snowy Boston. What if Boston actually is at the forefront of something important here? And so that was January 2020, we sent that article.
Yeah, right before COVID.
COVID hits. We don't talk to the Boston Globe for 6 months or something, because we turned to COVID specific projects, and so do they. So we get an email from in October or something like that in 2020 saying, from the editor at the opinion section, saying, hey, can we turn this into something bigger than just an article? And we're, of course, overjoyed and really excited to pursue this. So it turned into a year-long series that ran 2021 through 2022, a monthly series, sort of exploring every facet of how Boston could be this innovation hub. From there, we approached MIT Press with the idea of turning it into a book. But of course, we had to expand it beyond Boston at that point. We wanted to say, okay, we already did this thing with the Boston Globe, but let's back up. What is a longevity hub? Boston can't possibly be the only one. Are these hotspots of innovation for aging a real thing? Is there a body of theory to support this? And if these are real, what is happening in all these other cities? And luckily, Joe is more connected than anyone I could possibly imagine in terms of what is actually happening in the world of aging and innovation. So he had a list of cities that just right off the top of his head, he could say, these are hotspots where cool stuff is happening.
Well, so let's take that to you, Joe, and describe, what are longevity hubs and anything else you want to add to that. But I think that's a really compelling context on how this emerged. And, I read the book now, but I'm eager for our audience to know, how do you classify that longevity hub?
Well, and the other thing that is interesting, particularly about Boston, is that if you think about it, it has also the health and wealth bookends, if you will, of longevity.
Yeah.
I mean, Boston, believe it or not, only second to New York, has the highest concentration of financial services companies. So if you have a retirement plan or a pension, chances are it runs through Wellington, State Street, Fidelity, or a similar company, Mass Mutual, headquartered here in Boston. And then, of course, on the healthcare side, we've got the usual suspects at Luke. What's the name of the other school up the river? Oh yeah, Harvard. That's it. Harvard Medical School's up there, and Boston, BU Medical, and the like. And so that kind of came the bookends in between all these other things like senior housing and caregiving and the like. So longevity hubs. What is a longevity hub? Well, as Luke describes so well, it's basically sometimes a concentration, but a network of both awareness and organizations, both for-profit, nonprofit, and loose stakeholders, if you will, that not only are focused on improving the quality of life of people in their region, but suddenly have that catalytic, that ignition, if you will, to realize, wait a minute, not only can we do well for the people in Boston or Louisville or Newcastle, UK, whatever it is, suddenly it's translating old age into a new opportunity for business. And so longevity hubs are effectively loosely affiliated networks of organizations that are trying to improve quality of life at the regional level and realize that they have the power to turn it into a global export, essentially making longevity and aging a competitive advantage rather than a problem to be solved.
So I want to dive in a moment to some of the cities and what you see in them as case studies. But before we get there, I just want to lay out a little bit more of this longevity economy, which you've also written about, Joe. And that is around how aging is really changing the consumer marketplace and the labor marketplace. And so maybe just before we jump into the cities and their unique capabilities here, can you talk a little bit about how longevity is changing the economy, particularly in terms of consumers and labor?
So why don't we do this solemn-esque? Luke, do you want to do the economy and I'll take workforce?
Sure, sure. So I mean, it's hard to overstate how profoundly the aging of the baby boom generation in particular, and that's not true in every country, but it is true in the United States. Um, and just population aging more broadly is changing the face of the consumer population writ large. So yeah, and in the United States, you have the baby boom generation post war. The baby boom population shape is shaped differently in different countries. But it's a it's a big bulge in the python, as we say in the United States, and throughout the lives of the baby boomers, their demand has rewritten the map of the United States. I mean, before they were born, their parents moved into the new suburbs that were being built in Levittown. The interstate highways were laid down and suburbs sprung up all along them. The baby boomers drove the building of classrooms, and then they drove the building of malls and condominiums and then bigger houses. And now you can see where it's going. We're talking about retirement housing. How many years in a row has the Villages in Florida been the fastest growing metro area in the United States? I think it's like 14 years in a row. But it's not just housing. It's not just where they live. It's what they buy, what they want, who's creating the opportunities for them as consumers. When people estimate their the sheer spending power, it's always in the many trillions of dollars. It depends who you ask, but it's in the dozens of trillions of dollars. It's an incredibly powerful consumer group, and that's just on the purchasing side. On the labor side, they're incredibly important as well.
Well, I'll just note two facts on this just before we come to you, Joe. On the labor side, they're driving more than half of consumer spending, people over 50, that is,
Yes.
and hold now 75+% of household wealth in the country. So it's immense. And you see brands that are now catering, and many, for example, brand-oriented companies. I'm thinking of L'Oreal has just put out something about how there are this many people working here who are over 50 in their marketing now. The people that they're showing, they are much more likely to be middle-aged than they were a generation ago. There's still a lot of makeup on. You don't always know that they're middle-aged. They know it at the bottom. This person is 60, even if that's not apparent. But that is changing the whole economy, right? So that's a profound example. And let me come to you, Joe, on workplace. But I just wanted to add to everything you're saying, Luke.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, just to add a little bit of color. I mean, it's those darn boomers again, of which I have to claim that I am at the tail end of. But if you remember, they were the folks that basically made everything about the youth because they were young. I think that suddenly we woke up, look in the mirror, and said, "Oh my God, I'm not young anymore." So suddenly now aging is becoming cool. And it's not just about the numbers. It's not just about the fact they have more education than any previous generation of older adults in history. It's about a new generation gap. The gap is expectations. This is a generation, and by the way, they're the ones that are behind the boomers, I think, are even more so. They expect a pill, a product, or a policy, not just to help them live longer, but indeed something to help them live better. And that white space between previous generations that were patient and polite and this new pushy generation is basically the new white space for innovation, investment, and capital markets and the like. So, Seth, let's talk about the labor force. When I entered the workforce in the early 80s, it was pretty simple. There were younger workers and there were older workers. Well, now that people are living longer, that does not necessarily mean more time in retirement. You may retire, but maybe you're stepping down slowly. Maybe you're doing a gig job. Maybe you're working part-time. Maybe if you're the type, you can consult. And so what we're finding now is I want you to imagine no longer just younger and older workers. We have one, two, three, four, and depending on how you cut it, you could argue five, maybe six generations of workers. I mean, think about the millennials, 75, 78 million people called millennials, or 70 million baby boomers who are left out there. You can't call 70 something million of anything one thing. That'd be like calling the United Kingdom all one country. So now we're looking at a what I've been calling a generational alchemy in the workplace of different expectations for what career is, what's the role of the employer, what do I expect in benefits and compensation. So we got a whole new, shall we say, world of conflict, consensus, and shall we say, a lot of treaty making between the generations.
Well, and to complicate things further, I mean, what you're describing, in the old days, for example, you might say young and old. And then there would be a typical way in which those workers were stratified within a company.
Yep.
And, as people live longer, but potentially start entirely new careers, they may start, even though they're in their 50s or 60s, where there's a 30-year-old next to them. And so it's also changing the dynamic of hierarchy simultaneous to adding more complexity in terms of the number of generations that are in that room. And the possibilities now that people actually climax and then continue, but in roles that may not be as high in the hierarchy, is becoming much more common, at least from some of the data that I've seen.
Seth, you and I are both in academia, and I like to equate it in many ways academia like government service. Time in grade gives you rank. Well, one of the things that we're starting to see is, the new kid that's interviewing for that job, maybe a one step above intern, the new kid actually is maybe a 60-year-old who literally just recently retired, but either wants to start an entirely new career altogether, or maybe just wants a part-time gig in something they used to have some experience in.
Well, so let's jump into the heart of the book, which are these cities and how they've built these regional longevity hub ecosystems. And so, can you talk about a few cities that are becoming powerhouses of aging innovation and what makes them thrive? How did they get there? If we can go through a few case studies.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. But first, let me
Yeah.
so just the Boston example to start, because it's important. When we went into this project, it's a descriptive project to describe what we see out there in the world of these hubs. And so our theory, our hypothesis going in was based on Boston. And the idea behind these hubs, as we entered this, was that as Joe and I just described with this longevity economy talk, there are companies that are with it that, as you just said, are successfully marketing to older people and having more age diverse marketing and so on. And then there are companies who are kind of behind the curve, and that knowledge of what to do and how to innovate and how to create products that aren't big, beige, and boring, as we say, but actually excite people in the way that they've become accustomed to being excited by products and by companies throughout their whole lives. The companies that figure that out, that's kind of like secret knowledge, right? First of all, you have to have the knowledge that this is even a demographic worth shooting for. So traditionally, marketing was 18 to 49. You don't bother with beyond 49. So you have to know it's worth it, and then you have to know how to do it. And that's very tricky because marketing and product design for a group of people, 65% of whom, 65% of people over the age of 75, this is an oldie but a goodie, don't think of themselves as old. That's from a Pew poll from a few years ago. How do you market for a demographic that doesn't think of itself that way? How do you? It's not as square as saying you're a 20-something, go buy this drink for 20-somethings. You know what I mean? And so the idea of secret knowledge fits very well into the theory behind innovation clusters, which goes back to 1910, or actually 1890, the work of Alfred Marshall, the British economist. And the idea is that you have sort of a local body of knowledge, for instance, in the manufacturing trade. That knowledge sloshes between industries, and it helps make it worth it for industries to be situated in a given location. And it makes perfect sense for a manufacturing community in the 1800s or something like that. But as we discovered, and as Michael Porter, the strategist from
Yeah.
Harvard Business School, described at some length, there's another kind of knowledge which can be deep knowledge into changing and even ephemeral consumer demand, which is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about the longevity economy. We have this changing locus of demand. And what if there are cities where there's a community of people who are just more finely attuned to the changing demand conditions? In the same way that in Michael Porter's work, he talks about these communities of practice in the 1970s that were making these fine leather goods and footwear and so on that were attuned to the demand of the growing global middle class. And so that was our hypothesis going in. And that was sort of what we were seeing in Boston. So to circle back around to your question, this is what we were seeing. This is the kind of thing we're seeing in Boston. This is what we see at MIT AgeLab and a lot of the startups that we've worked with closely or not so closely. For instance, we have Kyle Rand, who is one of our local entrepreneurs and a great test case, who has this company Rendeavor, which is VR headsets for people in nursing homes. It's just like for him to even want to do that as a young entrepreneur speaks to a certain level of being plugged into this as an issue, right? And so that's what we're going in as Boston. We're thinking about it this way as Boston. We spread the net wider to the world, and we saw different types of hubs come back to us. So there were some that were like kind of like Boston, but with a twist. So I'm thinking of Newcastle as this great example. Newcastle in the UK, which is a hub with whom we have some good connections there. So that had its origins in biomedical sciences going back to the 1960s. This gentleman, Thomas Kirkwood, who is a really important researcher in the biology of aging, he had this theory called the disposable soma theory of aging, which remains one of the discussed theories of why aging happens. He invested a lot in the local hospital system and brought in a lot of investment. And so it became this sort of biological hub for studying Alzheimer's disease, among other things. But along the way, the issue got a certain status in the government, and government is very important when we're talking about healthcare in the UK. And as this snowball started rolling in Newcastle, and companies from the United States started to pay attention, including Microsoft and IBM, they started viewing Newcastle as a test case for understanding what are the emerging problems that need to be solved with technology in aging in the UK, in countries where there's more of a socialized healthcare system. And so they started viewing Newcastle as this test case. And they've done really interesting things in Newcastle. For instance, this speaks to how broad the solution base can be, but just improving transportation accessibility meant that older people living in the outskirts could get in during the day to the shops at a time when there weren't that many customers. Shop owners were happy. The people going to the shops were happier. It helped revitalize the local economy. And also a lot of investment in convening institutions, which is a commonality we see throughout these hubs, where you have universities and other places where companies and government and NGOs can get together and talk, and even across sectors, and talk about the issues and solutions that they're coming up with.
Yeah, and I
So
think what's really interesting is that across the board, you can have different, what we might call issue entrepreneurs that catalyze how these things come together. So to use the Newcastle example, that was, as Luke was saying, spurred not just by kind of latent research that had been there for decades, but by the government recognizing that the region of Northumbria is one of the oldest regions in the UK, and that they had stakeholders like the National Health Service for that area that was there, the City Council of Newcastle saying we need to do something. But then the University of Newcastle was able to get a very large grant to create an amazing research center called the National Innovation Center on Aging, NICA. And one of our authors, Gregor Ray, noted how that kind of institutionalized that world or that hub versus, say, in Louisville, Kentucky, here back in the United States, it was largely a more monolithic. It was around healthcare, health insurance, senior housing, older adult products such as adult diapers and whatnot. But it was catalyzed largely in many ways, by Humana, the CEO of Humana, and others out there. So these need not be only government or industry. It really, I hate to say by chance, but it's almost spontaneous combustion when people turn around and realize we have stakeholders, we have resources, but more importantly, we have consumer needs.
Well, it sounds, to draw the analogy again to Silicon Valley, like some of these institutions play an anchoring function and become a source of some of the secrets that give you a competitive advantage. So I think of Silicon Valley and I think of these companies where, in theory, you can learn about what's happening in Meta and elsewhere, being anywhere in the world. But when you're in Silicon Valley, you're hearing about it earlier. You're hearing about it when it's still in development. You're generating ideas off of that. And Luke, coming back to your earlier point that people are typically, if they're retired, not in the workforce at the same time, right? These are secrets in some ways to the people that are doing the work because they don't learn the secrets until they're out of work. And so for companies to be able to learn about this, it is a competitive advantage. And so if you have a Humana or some of these others, right, that becomes like a meta of this world in a certain sense. And you build an ecosystem around it and it gives you some secret knowledge that allows you to be in market in a differentiated way, maybe faster, maybe more personalized to the consumer. So again, it's a fascinating example. What are some of the challenges faced by these longevity hubs? What do you see as some of the lessons we can learn along the way when you look at maybe what hasn't worked in these places or differentially has worked across different longevity hubs?
Well, I would say that no hub is guaranteed future success. And so it's so interesting that you bring up Silicon Valley, because as we all know, Silicon Valley, just like Boston and Chicago and other big cities, there's a big issue with affordability and desirable places to live. That's so interesting because part of the reason Silicon Valley happened where it did was a certain level of path dependency that started with sort of like the godfathers of Silicon Valley. We talk about Fairchild, Semiconductor, and so on. And so one of the godfathers is William Shockley, who was one of the three inventors of the transistor. And what people forget about why William Shockley was in the Bay Area is that he moved there because his ailing mother was living there. And I think that's important because family ties, and the same thing happened with Bill Gates. They were setting up shop in Albuquerque, and he and Paul Allen moved back to Seattle to be close to family. And it shows you how these sort of invisible threads of where people are living, where people want to be living, can be determinative for what happens afterwards.
Yeah.
And I think about that a lot when I think about the viability of the Boston hub, because people are leaving Massachusetts for more affordable cost of living. And that's a problem because part of the idea that we posit in this book is that good ideas for what older consumers want have to come from somewhere, and they have to be checked against the lived experience of real people.
Yeah.
And it hurts if people are leaving town, and because that makes it harder. So just the viability of a community is something that could make or break its possibility as a longevity hub. Now, I say that as Joe is getting at, there are a few different flavors of hubs that turned up in our research here, and so there are some more top-down. Boston is an example of sort of a grassroots hub that developed from the grassroots on up. Another great example is Sao Paulo, where there's basically no government support whatsoever. It's basically a bunch of entrepreneurs who talk to each other on a WhatsApp group every day, which is really inspirational, actually. It's really cool what's going on in Sao Paulo in Brazil. But some other hubs in our research are extremely top-down in terms of their organization. So I'm talking about the Eastern Economic Corridor of Thailand, which is trying to convert a long-time retirement destination into an advanced healthcare destination for health tourism. And Dubai in the UAE is also trying to lure in retirees from abroad. And the idea is in both of these places is to bring in a lot of expatriate retirees from high income countries to come and live there and spend money and get good healthcare. And to do that, you have to build a lot of hospitals and things like that. And so in the Thailand chapter, there's actually a Q&A with one of the doctors who's involved with this joint hospital university effort to build a very large hospital. And he's asked by our authors, what is he worried about? And he says he's worried about a change of interest in the government or a change in the university structure that could just pull the plug on the whole thing.
Huh.
So you have sort of grassroots and top-down hubs, and you have grassroots and top-down problems. With the top-down, the support can cease at any moment. With the grassroots, there could be grassroots problems like affordability in a given location.
Joe, anything to add before we jump into some of the questions in the chat?
No, I think it sounds good. We'll jump in and jump into questions there. I guess just, kind of just a little bit to add on to Luke's point is that these tend to be loose networks that form a hub, and they're continually dynamic because both ideas, technologies, and people are fluid. Those that will be likely successful for the long term are likely to be those that have some sort of institutional staying power. So, going back to Newcastle, the fact that they were able to create a multi-million-dollar innovation center, not just for Newcastle, but for all of the UK, is probably something that will keep that there, or that the industry in Louisville is strong enough where that'll continue. And with any luck, MIT will be here for a long time as well, continuing in the aging space as well.
Got to have those paperweights, right, Joe?
Exactly.
Well, so we have a lot of questions in the chat. So let me start with Greg Gosix. He asked, could the speakers comment on other potential global aging hotspots like Japan and Italy, and the distinctive innovations and policies on longevity pursued there? In Japan in particular, I'm struck by the literal age, which I believe is one of the oldest average life expectancies in the world, in the lower to mid 80s. But I don't know how much you've looked at some of these other places or want to comment on them.
Yeah, I'd be happy to comment on both of those. I'll try to be brief because I know there's a lot of questions. So we have a great chapter on Japan in the book by John Metzler of Haas Business School. And what's happening in that chapter and in Japan is what is happening to a lot of these sort of monopolar countries where you have one gigantic city and then the outskirts around it. So Tokyo sucks up a lot of the young people from surrounding towns. And what's happening is Japan as a country is aging, but the rural areas around Tokyo are aging much faster because of that effect.
Huh.
And what John highlights are these hotspots where younger people are kind of moving back and working remotely and living with their children's grandparents to some extent. And you sort of have these, and these are often like very beautiful, naturally desirable places to want to live, like Nagano, where they had the Olympics, and these wonderful islands. These are places where you can get to Tokyo if you have to, for instance, for advanced medical care in an hour or two, but also you can work remotely and have a really high quality of life. So that's one thing we're keeping an eye on in Japan, are these places where they're starting to pull back from this young people sloshing all towards Tokyo trend, and saying, oh, well, here's some places where it might be a really nice place for multiple generations to live. In Italy, we have a really interesting longevity hub in Milan, so Italy is really interesting. We have these longstanding multi-generational families and very old housing, like in some instances, ancient housing, quite literally. And there was sort of an incursion from a French group to start to build senior housing and retirement housing, and people cottoned on to that in Milan. And now there's been a boom in senior housing, and also some policy changes that are more friendly towards older adults, and also more attention from the financial sector as well, which has always been a strength of Milan. So that's something interesting that's happening in Italy as well.
And you have to give Milan credit and Italy credit that fashion is not too far in the background. I give you an example, Ducali and the others are taking ideas from the motorcycle industry, motorcycle wear, to understand, gee, are there safety systems that we can build into stylish clothing that may help people, that instead of falling and breaking a hip, you can look good, but also have protective clothing, if you will. So these hubs are definitely going to be, some will be wide in their aperture of what they do. Others, with the Italians, you can imagine in Milan in particular, fashion will be part of the equation as well.
Well, being very clumsy and unfashionable, I feel like that would solve two tricks for me at once. So I'll hope that innovation comes forward. Allison Levin has a question. Can you speak to any innovations you are seeing to solve the crisis around insufficient solutions to care for the elderly? For example, the lack of labor force in the care space, costs are unaffordable, quality is poor. And this could not just be from this book and the innovation hubs, but also from your Age Lab more broadly. We're seeing this beginning now acutely, but obviously that baby boomer population is still pushing through the system. And so the imagination, especially with immigration potentially slowing, is that we could be in a place where we really have acute needs from a, balanced perspective of demand versus supply as we look to the future. What are your thoughts on that question? Are there innovations that are potentially enabling solutions to this?
Look, I do not believe that high tech will ever replace high touch. That said, you are seeing innovations in robotics and monitoring systems and the like. So, from the very rudimentary, reminding people to take their medications, managing nutrition, and the like, there are some roboticists out there that are saying that within 5 years, for the price of a vehicle, however, so the equity issue becomes a problem. But for the price of a new car, you may start to envision a robot, even a humanoid robot, being, shall we say, a care provider of sorts in your home. You're already seeing, for instance, the state of New York subsidizing robots for social connection, not just remind people to take their meds, but to engage in conversation. Again, I'm not a proponent believing that high tech is going to replace high touch. But in addition to immigration, perhaps not having enough people to provide care, let alone the shortage we have at home, there's another shortage we forgot about too. The baby boomers had fewer children, and
Yeah.
behind them, Gen X even had fewer children. And the millennials so far are not showing any propensity to have more children. The number one way we aged well in society was not exercising, following doctor's orders, or even saving a retirement, but it was
Having
family.
kids.
And now that family is short supply, I think we're going to be coming very close to a catastrophic care gap over the coming decades.
Oh,
Yeah,
Joy, yeah,
just to add a couple points. I mean, one thing we're talking about in longevity hubs is these are cities that may financially benefit from these trends. So there might be sort of a competitive advantage thing happening where, contrary to these larger population aging trends and their consequences, cities who get with it and industries that get with it a little bit may benefit and may be able to afford some of these things that are scarce elsewhere. Another point I'd like to make is, still to this day, you could have someone with a great solution to some of these problems who isn't taken seriously by sort of the venture capital pipeline. And I'll give you an example. I spoke with a gentleman with an AI bidet company, and don't laugh, because toileting is one of the great challenges of family and professional caregiving, right? I probably don't need me to tell you that. Something that could potentially greatly relieve a lot of the stress there. And he's been, frankly, having trouble getting people to take him seriously as a founder, despite having, by all accounts, a very effective product and some customers lined up who would be happy to buy it from him, right? Including institutional customers. And that just speaks to, when you have sort of the ecosystem and the venture capital pipeline lined up and ready to accept some of these ideas, you might get a breakthrough.
Yeah,
well,
I think
I'm
that's
just,
probably the biggest thing that we need as an innovation. It's not necessarily another technology, a service, or even policy, but we need a new narrative for old age, that it is
yeah.
not only a problem or a challenge, but it can also be an opportunity to extend quality of life for, frankly, everyone. If you have any luck, you'll get to enjoy it as well.
Well, I think to the points we've already made about who's in the room and how these decisions ultimately get made, right? Entrepreneurs are really great at solving problems that they've experienced. And to your
Mhm.
point, right? If you're bringing something, and this is true not just of people in old age, it's true of people of color, it's true of women who have, less access to capital in some of these investments. And if we look at health or other things, right? The solutions that the private market has often put out for people that don't look like a primary audience, and that's not a surprise
Yep.
because we all know that the easiest group to innovate for is ourselves in a certain sense. I experienced this problem. I know firsthand, I understand its significance. Therefore, as I'm developing a solution, I can rely on this very embedded set of knowledge, right? That is a huge benefit to entrepreneurs. It's a beautiful thing, but it also means that if there are people that aren't in the room in equal measure, right, that bidet problem, that's not taken seriously because I can't comprehend it in the same way that someone who's experiencing it is. So I think it's a great example of how that plays out here and elsewhere in the economy in a number of ways. In this case, though, one benefit that people have older is they do have 75% of household wealth. So even if initially people may not realize these are problems, that tends in a capitalist economy to be a pretty good way to incent attention to that
Yeah.
need. Joe, you're going to say something.
And I think you see that probably best perhaps in an industry that where the AgeLab actually began, which was in the auto industry. And until recently, if you bought a car, you can pretty much guarantee that that car was designed by and pretty much for a 5'10", 165-pound male. Both in terms of seating arrangements, controls, what was cool, what wasn't. And it's only been recently that people have started to realize, oh, wait a minute, the high tech, high style, and high priced vehicles are being bought by people over age 60. And by the way, a lot of women over 60 buying those luxury cars.
Well, so we have many more questions in the chat. We'll try to do some power round here to get as many in as possible. We have from Frank Echo, please comment on how you see longevity hubs evolving as successive generations move into the senior position. How do you see this playing out, over generations?
So I think a really important point is the influx of actually younger people getting involved in these issues. And so that's something that we see both in Boston and Newcastle is you have university programs dedicated to this, and it becomes an ongoing process of responding to the consumer demands and also building new things that consumers haven't asked for yet. But people from a young age getting involved and saying, this is something I want to get my hands dirty doing.
The next question on here comes from Gail Zalitsky. Are intergenerational workforces factored in for innovation? So how do you think about making the most of that intergenerational workforce?
Factored into the creation of hubs or the emergence of hubs overall. I think what we're finding is that the push and pull of the labor market is starting to make companies realize that two things. One, there is not just a nice long line of people who want to take over jobs that we used to believe that younger people would wish you just get out of the way because I want to take your job. If you want to be a doctor these days, the average age of a physician is 55. If you want a cardiologist, average age is 61. And by the way, all those power plants we need to power AI, we can't find a nuclear engineer that's not retired anymore. We forgot how to build, let alone how to maintain these things. So I think we're starting to see multi-generational and older workers become integrated, not because we found a new moral high ground, it's because we need them.
Right. This was always about competitive advantage of whether it's a region or a company. And ultimately I kind of have a cold-blooded point of view about the workforce, which is companies that figure out how to take advantage of the intellectual property and capital and the skills in their older workers. Those are companies that are going to do better.
We have a question here about how to think about the role of universities. And you've given a couple examples where they become an anchor from a knowledge perspective, like in Newcastle. How have you seen universities play a role in this longevity ecosystem?
I think I'm going to tee it up, Luke. Two things. One, answer that from our research, but also don't be shy. You've got a book with Sanjay on grasp and education and learning. So go for it.
All right, we want to hear about this book, Luke.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, so it's this yellow book back here. I should have brought it up because of course you study lifelong learning. But so I authored this book with Sanjay Sarma, who's the head of open learning at MIT, which I won't take too much time because it is a book I could talk for many hours about. But going into this book, I took an idea from Joe. So Joe has this overarching idea from the AgeLab, which is to say, if an older person can't use a technology, that doesn't mean they're dumb. That means it's by definition a bad technology because you define it based on what the consumer can use, right? You don't blame the consumer. And my thought going into this, and Sanjay agreed with me, was let's apply that ethos to learning. Let's not blame the learner when something goes wrong. Let's figure out all the points where we can just simply make things more user-friendly for learners. And that's what this book is all about. It's all about making things more cognitively user-friendly for learners. And there are all these points in cognitive science where you have a deal-breaking problem emerge, and it's all about blasting those problems away. When I think about lifelong learning in the university, that's what I think about. And it's not the log jams and the roadblocks to learning are not just cognitive in terms of learning and memory in the brain. It's also motivational. It's also about let's meet people where let's make this structured learning in such a way that people are excited to learn about it, where it's situated within problems they really care about. It's the same thing, it's the classic, oh, why can't grandma program the VCR? Now I'm dating myself. It's because the value proposition was never there, right? Why would anyone learn something that's difficult to learn if they don't care about the answer to it? There needs to be a value proposition. And so I think that's something that a university can really continue doing, is to make learning worth it and situate it in a way that is worth it for people of all ages.
So Seth, at the risk of kicking our industry that pays our mortgages, twofold. One, compliments to you and other programs like the one that you operate in terms of having a lifelong learning approach. That said, people are looking to universities to be incredibly innovative, and in certain areas we are. But keep in mind, we still get together once a year in medieval garb and hand out paper. So we're not exactly at the front end of what society is going to be. That said, think about the following. If we are truly going to be living 80, 90, maybe 100 years, the pace of knowledge, the changes in technology are going to require something far better than a 4-year degree or a 2-year master's or whatever you want it beyond that. Yep. Universities, and if not them, somebody else is going to eclipse us, where you're going to live in a world where school is never out, not just because you want to be able to learn for self-aggrandizement, but to make the business case that you can stay in the workplace as young as 30 or 40, because knowledge is moving so quickly. I dare say that the new older worker is probably 35 years old. Think about it. ChatGPT just came out a couple of years ago. That means somebody in the workplace today that's 25 or 30 is learning in real time, the same as a 50, 60, or 70-year-old.
Well, and to maybe close the conversation, I think that's what's so interesting about what the longevity economy is going to contend with, which is a pace of change that is so rapid that it will again redefine what that second half of life looks like. And to your point, Joe, on the education side, I think there's another trend that's equally interesting, which is that if you look at how people want to meet the marketplace today, there's a greater sense of urgency, I think, among our 18-year-olds. We see that in more pre-professional majors, as an example. And so I think people are aiming to get more of that professional connection earlier than they used to. We're finding, though, that many people actually return to the liberal arts in their 50s and 60s. And in some ways, reading these great books and other endeavors, there's a unique appreciation you can bring when you're in your 50s, because
true University of Chicago dean, you brought up the great books.
Well, we believe in them here. We're a yes and though. We believe there are other great books too.
So I'm going to say something that's going to get me in trouble with my home team, if you will. I believe that the liberal arts are going to have a competitive advantage because it's going to be profoundly human, that profoundly intuition that comes from things like the great books and that kind of insight that will give the individual competitive advantage, because the algorithm will always be faster, more efficient, and correct. But it's the intuition that will make sure that it's aimed in the right direction.
Well,
that's right. So let me just one more thing. Technical education, the problem has always been that it can get outmoded very quickly by changing conditions. So to Joe's point, liberal education is quite future proof. And so it's worth doing at any age.
Well, this was a fascinating discussion on longevity hubs. I'm glad we ended by agreeing that any longevity hub should have the liberal arts and some component of it so that people stay cognitively agile and become part of this very important human connection. Thank you both for your time and even more for your research, which is helping us all to live better lives. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks for having us, Seth. Take care.
Thank you so much.